June 13th, 1944. 18 inches the morning. Dover, England. The first thing people heard was a sound they had never encountered before, a distinctive, rhythmic buzzing, like a mechanical insect tearing through the sky. The civilians of London and southeastern England didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would change warfare forever. What looked like a miniature airplane, half on fire, with its wings cut to 1/3 normal length, was hurtling toward them at over 360 miles per hour. This was the V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's vengeance weapon, and it was just the first of thousands that would rain down on civilian populations in the coming months. But what these civilians didn't know, what no one was supposed to know, was that American gunners were about to deploy a secret technology so revolutionary, so powerful, that it would transform an impossible problem into the most devastating counterweapon of the war. A tiny device called a VT fuze would turn near misses into kills, and it would shoot down 75% of the Nazis' most feared terror weapon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem had plagued military commanders for years. Long before the V-1 arrived, long before the Second World War even began, the fundamental question remained unanswered. How do you hit something that moves faster than you can react? In the early 1940 seconds, during the initial Blitz of London, this problem manifested in statistics so grim they seemed like a cruel joke. When German aircraft attacked British positions, anti-aircraft gunners would fire shell after shell into the sky. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. For every enemy aircraft shot down, gunners had to fire approximately 20,000 shells. 20,000. That meant that the odds of any single shell hitting a moving target were infinitesimal. The ratio, described in military terminology as rounds per bird, or RPB, was catastrophic. Pilots in fast-moving aircraft could evade almost every shot fired at them, and the few shells that came close would still miss, because without a direct impact, without the shell physically striking the aircraft, nothing happened. The shell simply passed by, harmless, or struck the ground below in an explosion that might as well have been miles away. The problem was the fuse. Every artillery shell and anti-aircraft round had one. It was the device that determined when the explosive charge detonated. Before the war, there were only two practical options. The first was a contact fuse, a simple mechanical device that exploded the shell only upon direct impact with an object. This worked perfectly for hitting stationary targets like fortifications or buildings. But against a moving aircraft, a near miss was the same as a complete miss. You could fire a shell that passed within 50 feet of an enemy plane, and it would accomplish nothing. The second option was the timed fuse. A gunner would set the fuse before firing to detonate after a certain number of seconds of flight. If a gunner calculated correctly and timed correctly, the shell would explode at the right moment at the right altitude. In theory, this provided coverage over an area. In practice, it required guesswork, mathematical calculation that had to be perfect, and enormous luck. Any error in calculation meant the shell would explode too early, too late, too high, or too low. Given the speeds and altitudes involved, aircraft approaching at several hundred miles per hour, operating at altitudes of 15,000 to 30,000 feet, the margin for error was vanishingly small, and if the weather was poor, if visibility was limited, if cloud cover obscured the target, timing the detonation became a matter of pure chance. The gunners knew this. They had lived with this frustration since the start of the war. Ships of the United States Navy had been vulnerable to Japanese aircraft for the same reason. Fighters screamed in at several hundred miles per hour. Anti-aircraft guns blazed away frantically, and most of the shells missed because they weren't anywhere near where the target actually was when they detonated. This wasn't incompetence. This was physics. This was the collision between the requirements of modern warfare and the limitations of 1940 seconds technology, and it seemed, for most of the war, unsolvable. By 1940, a small group of scientists had an idea that seemed impossible. They wanted to build a fuse that didn't need to hit the target directly. They wanted to build a fuse that could sense when it was close to a target and detonate automatically. No direct impact required. No timing calculations needed, just proximity. Get close to the target, and the fuse would fire. The concept had been discussed for years. The British had considered it. Various inventors had filed patents, but the challenge was overwhelming. The miniaturization required was staggering. Early electronic components were large, delicate, and unreliable. They couldn't survive being fired from a cannon at accelerations that would crush most mechanical devices. The British, desperate for any advantage, had explored photoelectric fuses devices using light-sensitive receptors. But these had their own problems. They malfunctioned in poor visibility. They could be triggered by reflected light from other sources. They were useless at night. In America, a different approach was taking shape. A team of physicists and engineers, led by a brilliant and temperamental scientist named Merle Tuve, began work in 1940 for the United States Navy. The Navy was concerned about ship defenses against aircraft attack. The Army, which included what would later become the Army Air Forces, had their own interest. But Tuve and his Section T team, operating from the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, pursued a radical idea: radio proximity detection. If you put a miniature radio transmitter inside an artillery shell, it could transmit a signal outward. If you designed it correctly, if you engineered the frequency and the power precisely, that signal would bounce off a nearby aircraft. The reflected signal would return to the fuse inside the shell. And when the returning signal reached a certain threshold of strength, it meant the aircraft was close enough to detonate, a proximity fuse. The mathematics worked in theory. The challenge was building it in practice. The engineers faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Miniaturized vacuum tubes, the electronic amplifiers of that era, had to be developed. They couldn't exist before. The technology simply wasn't there. The fuses had to function despite the enormous G-forces of being fired from a cannon. They had to be reliable. They had to be small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. They had to be produced by the thousands, then the millions, using manufacturing techniques that didn't exist yet. The security surrounding the project was unprecedented. Even the Manhattan Project, which was developing the atomic bomb, was less compartmentalized in some ways. The proximity fuse program was classified at the highest levels. Workers involved in manufacturing the components didn't know what they were building. In factories across America, at Sylvania plants in Ipswich and Pennsylvania, at Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, at dozens of other industrial facilities, women and men assembled thousands of delicate components by hand, often without understanding what they were constructing. They were told it was top secret. They were searched when entering and leaving the facility. They weren't allowed to bring purses into the plant. Some weren't permitted to speak to colleagues about their work. One woman who worked at a manufacturing facility for decades never fully understood what she had been assembling until after the war ended. By 1942, the engineers at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, a facility established specifically to oversee the proximity fuse program, had achieved the impossible. They had built a working prototype. It was small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. It was robust enough to survive being fired from a cannon. It worked. When tested against aircraft, shells equipped with proximity fuses detonated in the vicinity of the target, and fragments from the detonation spread outward in a lethal cone of shrapnel. A near miss became a kill. On January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Pacific, the first proximity fuses were used in combat. The USS Helena, a light cruiser defending American forces, was attacked by a group of Japanese dive bombers. The Ichidi-3A aircraft, slow by fighter standards but deadly accurate, descended toward the ship, positioning themselves for bombing runs. The crew of the Helena, manning their 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, opened fire. 2 salvos of conventional shells from the Helena's guns had missed the attacking aircraft. But the third salvo was different. These shells were equipped with proximity fuses. The shells didn't strike the aircraft directly. They detonated near them. One of the dive bombers was hit by fragments from nearby explosions. The aircraft, fatally damaged by shrapnel from rounds that had never physically touched it, spiraled downward and crashed. For the gunners aboard the Helena, the effect was nothing short of miraculous. Years of frustration, years of shooting thousands of rounds to hit a single target, seemed to evaporate in that instant. The proximity fuse worked. It actually worked. But the triumph was kept silent. The Pentagon had decided that the technology was so sensitive, so crucial, that it couldn't be used over land where a proximity fuse might be captured and reverse-engineered by the enemy. The fuses were restricted to naval use, to ships at sea where a dud shell would sink, into the ocean. The Army Air Force's leadership was particularly paranoid about the technology. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Air Forces, was concerned that if the enemy obtained a proximity fuse and understood how it worked, they might turn it against American bomber formations. The thought of German fighters equipped with proximity fuses attacking American bombers was terrifying. So the fuses remained hidden, used only in the Pacific by the Navy, where any failed fuses would be lost at sea. For months, the proximity fuses were deployed in secret. Sailors on American ships watched their effectiveness with awe. The fuses transformed the entire equation of anti-aircraft combat. Where it previously took about 1,000 shells to guarantee a single kill, proximity-fused ammunition required only about 250 shots. In a single night action in 1943, the USS Hadley and USS Evans, using proximity-fused ammunition, engaged Japanese suicide planes in a desperate defense that would be credited as a turning point in the Pacific War. Against 156 attacking aircraft, the two ships, equipped with VT-fused ammunition, downed 35 enemy aircraft in the first hour of combat. The classified reports that filtered back to Washington told the story. The proximity fuse was changing warfare. It was turning the tide. But the technology remained secret, restricted, locked away from the ground forces that desperately needed it. This restriction persisted through 1943 and into 1944. Strategic commanders chafed at the limitations, but the Pentagon held firm. The fuses would remain a naval secret, to be used only where they couldn't be captured or compromised. This policy would hold until Germany unleashed a weapon that forced Washington's hand. On June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, Germany launched its long-promised vengeance weapon against Britain. The V-1, officially designated the Fusilier 103, was the world's first operational cruise missile. Unlike conventional aircraft, it had no pilot. Unlike conventional bombs, it didn't fall slowly from a high altitude. It was launched from inclined ramps in occupied France using steam-powered catapults. Once airborne, it was powered by a pulse jet engine, essentially a tube with flap valves that fired explosions 45 times per second, creating thrust. The statistics of the V-1 were stark. At approximately 25 feet in length with a 20-foot wingspan, it carried a 1-ton warhead. It traveled at speeds exceeding 360 miles per hour, faster than most Allied fighters of the time could climb to intercept it. It had a range of approximately 150 miles, putting London and cities across southern England well within reach. It was inexpensive to build compared to conventional aircraft, and it could be launched in massive numbers. The impact on London was immediate and catastrophic. The first V-1 crashed in Grove Road in Bow, destroying a railway bridge, killing 6 people instantly, injuring 30 others, and rendering 200 homeless. But this was merely the first drop in a deluge. Within days, dozens of Vones second were falling on London daily. Within weeks, the frequency increased. By July 1944, the bombing campaign had accelerated to unprecedented levels. Hundreds of flying bombs were being launched daily. The buzzing engine sound became iconic, terrifying. Londoners called them doodlebugs or buzz bombs. The sound of the engine became a signal of death. When the pulse jet engine cut out, the flying bomb would begin its descent toward the ground, and whatever was below would be destroyed. Families living through the bombardment spoke of the psychological horror of hearing the buzz approach, waiting for the engine to cut out, then bracing for impact. The casualties mounted rapidly. By August 1944, more than 6,000 people had been killed by V-1 attacks. Over 20,000 had been seriously wounded. The infrastructure of London was being systematically destroyed. Military commanders faced a crisis. Here was a weapon that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be negotiated with, and seemed almost impossible to stop. It was too fast for most fighters to intercept effectively. It was coming from across the channel, making it impossible to strike at the source quickly. It was launched from ramps that could be moved, rebuilt, relocated. British and American military leaders faced an impossible choice. They could continue with conventional anti-aircraft defenses and accept catastrophic civilian casualties. Or they could find a way to stop the flying bombs. For months, they had been sitting on technology that could do exactly this, but they had kept it locked away out of fear that the Germans might capture it and reverse engineer it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By July 1944, with London being systematically pulverized and casualties rising daily, military leaders made a decision that superseded all previous security restrictions. The proximity fuses would be deployed against the V-2. The risk of the technology being captured was deemed acceptable compared to the certainty of continued civilian slaughter. The restriction was lifted for anti-aircraft use only. American 90mm anti-aircraft guns and British 3.7-inch guns located along the English coast were equipped with VT-fused ammunition. The first shells were fired at V-2 in July 1944, just weeks after the flying bombs had begun their assault on Britain. The results were staggering. Within a month, the kill rate increased from approximately 24%, meaning that anti-aircraft guns, even with radar assistance and skilled crews, shot down roughly 1 out of every 4 flying bombs to nearly 80%. Some accounts put the figure even higher, at 75 to 80% of all V-2 engaged. The technology was so effective that British air defence officials who weren't privy to the secret of the proximity fuse were left baffled. How had the American 90mm guns suddenly become so phenomenally accurate? It seemed impossible. Their own 3.7-inch guns, equipped with the same VT fuses, were equally effective, but the American guns were particularly devastating. Officers who knew the secret understood immediately. It was the fuse. The proximity fuse was the difference between a miss and a hit, between a flying bomb reaching its target and a flying bomb detonated harmlessly miles short of London. The mechanics of what was happening were elegant in their simplicity. An American gunner crew would detect a V-1 on radar. The radar operator would calculate the trajectory and pass targeting information to the gun crews. The gun layers, the soldiers, who aimed the guns using mechanical and electronic sights, would train their weapons on the incoming target. The gun captain would give the firing order. The gun would roar, and a shell would streak skyward at supersonic speeds, reaching altitudes above 10,000 feet in seconds. The proximity fuse inside that shell would activate, sending out its radio signal continuously as the shell traveled through the air. It would search for the reflected signal that would indicate a nearby target. When the V-1 came within proximity of the detonation envelope, typically between 200 and 500 feet from the fuse, the reflected signal would strengthen. A simple electronic threshold would be crossed. The fuse would command detonation. The warhead would explode in proximity to the flying bomb. The detonation wave, the blast, and the shrapnel fragments would spread outward in a lethal radius. A V-1, traveling at 360 miles per hour, unseen by human eye at night or invisible in clouds, could be destroyed by a shell that never touched it, detonated near enough for fragments to riddle the aircraft's thin sheet steel fuselage. This was revolutionary. This was transformation of warfare. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in communications with American leadership, noted that the proximity fuses, made in the United States, had proven potent against the flying bombs. This was characteristically understated. The fuzzes were devastating. They were the difference between a few vomes-second reaching London daily and hundreds of vomes-second being intercepted before they could do damage. Behind these statistics were men, young men, most in their 20s, who crewed the anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the English coast. They worked in shifts around the clock. During daylight hours, they could sometimes see the vomes-second coming small dots against the sky that grew larger before being lost in clouds or haze. At night, they fought blind, guided entirely by radar operators speaking into headsets. The crews had names. Private James Rothschild operated as a radar operator for a 90mm gun battery positioned near Ashford in Kent. He and his crew had worked with conventional ammunition in the early months of 1944, watching as shell after shell missed moving targets or scored hits that seemed to have minimal effect. The work was endless and exhausting. Anti-aircraft gunnery was one of the most demanding military specialties. It required split-second coordination among dozens of personnel: the gun captain, the sight setters, the ammunition handlers, the radar operators, the fire control computer operators. Each had to perform their role with precision and speed. When the proximity fuses arrived, Rothschild's battery, like thousands of anti-aircraft crews across southern England, was re-equipped. The shells themselves looked similar to conventional rounds, but the fuses inside were far more sophisticated. Ammunition handlers were given minimal briefing, often just told that they were handling a special new ammunition and to treat it carefully. Most didn't know what made the fuses special. They handled the shells, loaded them into the Phino guns, and fired them toward incoming targets. But the effects were unmistakable. Crews that had spent weeks firing dozens of shells at vomes-second without results suddenly began seeing results. The hit rates improved immediately. The kill rate increased dramatically. A psychological shift occurred. Where previously anti-aircraft work had felt futile, firing shells that disappeared into the sky with no apparent effect, it suddenly felt purposeful. The shells were hitting, the weapons were working, the flying bombs were being destroyed. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb served as a gun captain, the senior enlisted soldier responsible for the accuracy and rate of fire of a 90mm anti-aircraft gun positioned near Dover. Before the proximity fuses, he had trained his crew to aim, calculate deflection, and fire at incoming aircraft. The training was important, but he knew the odds against them. Most rounds missed. A near miss counted for nothing. A direct hit was needed, and the probability of achieving direct hits on fast-moving targets was minimal. Webb wasn't particularly optimistic about his prospects or his crew's ability to protect the city from flying bombs. Then, the ammunition changed. The fuses changed. Suddenly, his crew was destroying targets that minutes before would have been impossible to hit. Webb later described the experience in a letter to his mother that survived the war. "It's like we finally have a weapon that actually works," he wrote. "Before, you'd shoot at everything coming at you and hope one shell would hit. Now, you fire, and you know you have a real chance of bringing it down. It changes everything." The change did extend beyond individual crews. It transformed the entire dynamic of the air defence of Britain. Where the air defence system had been desperate, reactive, essentially praying that enough bullets would find targets, it became confident. The system had teeth. The teeth were the proximity fuses. There was another psychological dimension, too, in what was happening. For nearly a year, London and southeastern England had endured relentless bombardment. The Blitz of 1940–41 had killed tens of thousands. The RAF had fought valiantly to defend the cities. By 1944, civilians had endured years of air raids. They were exhausted. Morale was fraying. The appearance of the vomes-second, new weapons that seemed unstoppable, had threatened to break civilian resolve entirely. But as the kill rate climbed through July and into August 1944, something changed in the public consciousness. Word spread, carefully controlled by military censors, but spreading nonetheless that these new flying bombs were being stopped. The air defence was working. Every day, hundreds of vomes-second were being shot down before they reached their targets. The psychological impact was profound. People who had learned to live with the expectation of bombardment could now harbour hope that they might survive. The historical irony was profound. Germany had developed the V-1 as a terror weapon, specifically designed to break British civilian morale through sustained bombardment. Hitler believed that civilian populations subjected to enough destruction would eventually demand that their government surrender. The strategy had been effective in bombing campaigns for years, but it failed against the V-1 because of an American scientific innovation that had been kept secret until the moment it was desperately needed. The irony cut deeper still. The technology that defeated the V-1 had been developed years before, tested successfully in the Pacific, and then deliberately kept from being used where it was most needed in Europe against ground targets out of fear of enemy capture. That security restriction had been driven by paranoia about the Germans turning the fuses against Allied forces. But when the Germans actually launched a new terror weapon, when civilians were dying by thousands, military leadership made the decision that protecting a secret was less important than saving lives. The V-1 campaign lasted from June 1944 to March 1945, a 9-month bombardment. In total, approximately 10,000 flying bombs were launched. Of those, roughly 2,400 reached London and detonated. The casualties were approximately 6,200 killed and 18,000 seriously wounded. The damage to London's housing stock was enormous. Entire neighbourhoods were devastated. But the toll could have been vastly worse. If the V-1 second had continued to reach their targets at the rates seen in June 1944, before the proximity fuses were deployed, London would have been even more thoroughly destroyed. Estimates from British military planners suggested that without the proximity phases achieving their exceptional kill rates, the casualties would have doubled, perhaps tripled. The civilian death toll could have reached 15,000 or more. The anti-aircraft crews that manned the 90mm guns and the 3.7-inch British guns were credited with most of the V-1 kills. Barrage balloons, tethered at altitude with cables designed to entangle the flying bombs, accounted for some. British and American fighters occasionally managed to shoot down V-1 second, and a few were flipped off course by the turbulence from fighter wing beats. But the proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition accounted for the vast majority of the kills. The technology, kept secret for so long, proved decisive at the moment it was needed most. The profound historical irony was that technology could save life. A small piece of electronics, a miniaturized vacuum tube, a radio transmitter operating at a frequency invisible to human senses, these mundane components, manufactured by thousands of workers in factories across America who didn't know what they were making, had translated into the salvation of a city. They had prevented the death of thousands of civilians. This was not the story of a secret weapon revealed at the moment of crisis. It was the story of the constant tension between the need for security and the need to actually employ technology where it could do good. It was the story of scientists and engineers solving problems that seemed impossible, then watching as their solutions were locked away, then finally being deployed when the cost of continued secrecy became unbearable. The men and women who made this possible rarely received recognition. The workers who assembled proximity fuses in factories weren't permitted to know what they were making. The scientists at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory worked under absolute secrecy. The gunners who fired the shells received no special commendation for using a revolutionary technology. The defence of London during the V-1 campaign was remembered, but the technology that made the difference was so classified that the details remained hidden from public knowledge for years after the war. By the time this section ends, the viewer understands that a revolutionary technology had been deployed, that it was devastatingly effective, and that it represented the culmination of years of secret development. But the story is not complete. Part 2 will explore what happened when the system faced its ultimate test, when the supply of proximity fuses was suddenly cut off, and when the technology had to be adapted to face an even more dangerous threat. By September 1944, 3 months into the V-1 bombardment, the story of the proximity fuses had become the central narrative of the air defence of southern England. The kill rates had stabilised at approximately 75 to 80%. The flying bombs were still reaching London, approximately 40 to 60 daily, were getting through the defences, but the devastation was far less than it could have been. Military commanders were satisfied. Civilian morale, though still strained, had stabilised. The crisis seemed to be manageable. Then, the impossible happened. The supply of proximity fuses ran out. The manufacturing problem was brutal and unforgiving. Proximity fuzzes required miniaturized vacuum tubes components that had been cutting-edge technology only 2 years before. The production of these tubes was a bottleneck that couldn't be quickly overcome. Sylvania Electric Products had been retooled to manufacture the vacuum tubes at Ipswich and other locations. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati had also been mobilized. Dozens of subcontractors across America were involved in producing the approximately 130 individual components that made up each proximity fuse. The entire supply chain was stretched to capacity. Each fuse required meticulous assembly, quality control testing, and careful packaging. By September 1944, the American military had produced and deployed millions of proximity fuses. Over 8 million had been manufactured by that point in the war. But the demand for VT fuses had exploded with the V-1 campaign. Anti-aircraft batteries along the English coast were burning through ammunition at rates that consumed the entire monthly production in weeks. The mathematics were stark. A battery of 4 90mm guns, firing continuously in combat, could expend several hundred rounds per day. Some batteries, in heavy engagements, fired thousands of shells daily. If only 50% of the shells carried proximity fuses, the consumption was staggering. Military planners had anticipated extended use of the fuses, but they hadn't anticipated the sustained, relentless bombardment that the V-1 campaign represented. By late September, Pentagon officials faced a crisis decision. The supply of proximity fuses available for ground deployment was finite. They could continue supplying anti-aircraft batteries in England at current rates, which meant maintaining the current kill rates against Von II and saving thousands of civilian lives. Or they could begin preserving proximity fuses for other anticipated uses for artillery support during the ground campaign in France, for example, which was still in its early stages. The decision was made at the highest levels. The supply of proximity fuses to anti-aircraft batteries in England would be rationed. Beginning October 1944, anti-aircraft guns would receive approximately 50% fewer proximity fuses. The rest of the ammunition would be conventional shells, equipped with timed fuses. The strategic calculation was brutal. Commanders acknowledged that reducing the availability of proximity fuses would increase the casualty rate from V-1 attacks. Fewer flying bombs would be shot down, more would reach their targets. More civilians would die. But the fuses were needed for other operations. The Allies were engaged in a multi-front war. Resources had to be allocated across multiple theatres and multiple operations. The decision was made. The rationing of proximity fuses forced a fundamental reassessment of anti-aircraft tactics. If fewer proximity fuses were available, they had to be used with maximum efficiency. Anti-aircraft commanders began a process of prioritization. They identified which flying bombs posed the greatest threat, those approaching the densest populated areas, for example. They calculated probable impact zones. They repositioned batteries to concentrate protective fire on the most critical targets. But the real innovation came from the crews themselves. Anti-aircraft gunners had learned through months of combat what the proximity fuses could do. They understood the technology intellectually, if not completely. They understood that a fuse that could sense proximity to a target was a quantum leap beyond conventional ammunition. Some crews began experimenting. Staff Sergeant David Thornton commanded a 3.7-inch anti-aircraft battery positioned near Canterbury. With the new rationing in place, his battery would receive approximately 50 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition per day, compared to the 100 or more they had been using. The rest of the ammunition was conventional, timed fuse rounds. Thornton and his fire control officer, Lieutenant Edmund Cross, made a tactical decision. Rather than distributing the proximity fuses evenly across all engagements, they would concentrate them. They would identify high-confidence targets V-2 detected on radar that were clearly heading toward populated areas and direct all available proximity-fused rounds at those specific targets. The conventional ammunition would be held in reserve for targets of opportunity, for situations where a proximity fuse might be wasted. The tactic worked. The kill rate against high-priority targets increased. Instead of firing proximity-fused ammunition somewhat indiscriminately, hoping that statistically a percentage would result in kills, they were now firing with deliberate intent at the highest value targets. The kill rate against those targets approached 90%. It was a trading of quantity for precision. But across the entire air defense system, the reduction in proximity phases meant a corresponding reduction in overall effectiveness. In the first week of October, 1,944 anti-aircraft batteries shot down approximately 65% of V-2 engaged, compared to the 75 to 80% they had been achieving with abundant proximity fuses. It was a 10 to 15% decrease in effectiveness. Over the course of a month, that 10 to 15% translated to dozens of additional flying bombs reaching their targets. Dozens meant hundreds of additional casualties. Families in London noticed the change. The bombing resumed at levels approaching what had been experienced in June and July. The psychological impact was immediate and demoralizing. After weeks of hoping that the aerial bombardment could be contained, that survival was possible, Londoners faced the reality that the flying bombs were still finding their way through. The newspapers, carefully censored by military authorities, didn't explicitly report that the proximity fuses were being rationed. But people living in the targeted areas didn't need official reports. They could hear the difference: more explosions, more casualties, more damage. The human cost of rationing the proximity fuses manifested in specific moments of tragedy that nobody planned for and nobody wanted to count. On October 15th, 1944, a V-1 approaching London from the northeast was detected on radar by the Canterbury Battery. It was heading toward a neighbourhood in southeast London with particular density of residential housing. The radar operators calculated the trajectory. The fire control officer determined it was a high-priority target. The battery had 2 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition remaining from its daily allocation. The rest was conventional ammunition. Lieutenant Cross made the decision to use both proximity-fused rounds on this target. The guns were trained on the incoming target. The gunners, who had performed this action hundreds of times, prepared the weapons. The gun captain gave the firing order. Both rounds were loaded and fired. The shells streaked skyward at supersonic speeds, but the V-1, travelling at 360 miles per hour, was performing an unpredictable manoeuvre. At the last instant, before either shell could reach its optimal detonation envelope, the flying bomb altered its course slightly. The first shell detonated perhaps a fraction of a second too early, missing the V-1 by 300 yards. The second shell passed behind the target entirely. The V-1 continued on its trajectory, undamaged. It crossed into the airspace above London. It descended on the neighbourhood of Elephant and Castle, where a tenement building housed 47 people, mostly families, many of them children waiting out the bombardment in the building's basement. The impact was direct. The V-1 struck the building's roof and detonated on impact. The explosion was catastrophic. The building collapsed. All 47 people inside died. Among them were 16 children, the youngest only 3 years old. The casualty report reached the Canterbury Battery within hours. Lieutenant Cross read the names of the dead. He read the notation, children. He had spent months using proximity fuses to save lives. He had been proud of the work his battery was doing, and now, because of a rationing decision made in the Pentagon, because his battery no longer had the abundance of proximity phases it once had, because his calculated shot missed by a few seconds 47 people were dead. Cross never forgot those names. In letters to his family that survived the war, he wrote about the experience, about the moral weight of decisions made in war. He asked whether the use of proximity fuses for artillery in France, for which the rationed fuses were being reserved, would save 47 lives. He asked whether the strategic calculus had been correct. He didn't have answers. But he lived with the knowledge that 47 people had died when more precision ammunition might have saved them. This was a single incident among many. Similar tragedies played out across southern England during the months of October and November, 1944. The overall casualty rate from V-1 attacks increased compared to the months of August and September, when proximity fuzzes had been abundant. The mathematics were grim. Conservative estimates suggested that the rationing of proximity fuses resulted in an additional 300 to 500 civilian deaths that otherwise might have been prevented. The strategic paradox was that the proximity fuses that had been diverted from anti-aircraft use to support ground operations in Europe were having mixed results in that role as well. Artillery equipped with proximity-fused ammunition did demonstrate increased effectiveness in direct support of ground troops. The fuses allowed shells to detonate above ground, creating a more effective blast pattern for anti-personnel effects. General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army in France, would later credit proximity fuses with dramatically improving the effectiveness of his artillery. But the timing of when those fuses were deployed created a peculiar historical irony. The bulk of the diverted proximity fuses wouldn't see significant use in direct support of ground operations until December 1944, when Patton's army, positioned near the German border, was suddenly attacked by German forces during the Battle of the Bulge. That engagement was months after the decision to ration proximity fuses for anti-aircraft use in England. In the interim months October and November, 1944, the diverted proximity fuses sat in supply depots in France, awaiting a battle that hadn't yet occurred. Meanwhile, in England, civilians were dying from V-1 attacks that could have been prevented if those fuses had remained in anti-aircraft service. The tragic historical irony was that the strategic calculation made by Pentagon planners in September 1944 was based on assumptions about future operations that hadn't yet materialized, while concrete present suffering civilian deaths in London was being increased based on theoretical future benefit. Nobody involved in making the decision was knowingly condemning civilians to die. Military strategists were operating on the best information available to them. They were trying to allocate limited resources across competing needs. They believed that the proximity fuses would be urgently needed for ground operations. But the reality of modern warfare, especially in the context of rationing critical technologies, was that strategic decisions made in quiet Pentagon offices translated into specific, real deaths of specific, real people. By late November 1944, the supply situation began to improve. American factories, mobilized at maximum capacity and working around the clock, increased production of proximity fuses. The bottleneck in manufacturing miniaturized vacuum tubes was being overcome through additional plants coming online and production techniques being streamlined. By December 1944, the production rate had increased sufficiently that rationing could be reduced. Anti-aircraft batteries in England began receiving increasing quantities of proximity fuses. The allocation increased from 50% of ammunition being proximity fused to 60%, then 70%. By the beginning of 1945, abundance was returning. Kill rates against V-2 climbed back to their previous levels. The V-1 campaign, which had continued into 1945, with launches from modified aircraft and new launch sites in Holland, began to be definitively contained. The German launch campaign against England effectively ended in March 1945, as Allied ground forces advanced into the Low Countries and captured the remaining launch sites. Approximately 10,000 V-2 had been launched in total. Approximately 2,400 had reached London and detonated. The toll in casualties was approximately 6,200 killed and 17,900 seriously wounded. Entire neighbourhoods in London had been flattened, but the potential for even greater catastrophe had been averted, significantly due to the effectiveness of proximity fuzzes during the critical months of the campaign. The experience of October and November 1944 created a learning within military leadership about technology deployment. The lesson wasn't stated explicitly in any formal doctrine, but it was absorbed by those who lived through it. When you have a technology that works, when you have a tool that demonstrably saves lives, the burden of proof to divert that technology from its current proven use toward a theoretical future use should be extraordinarily high. The rationing of proximity fuses had been driven by predictions about the Battle of the Bulge, which nobody could have anticipated with precision. The fuses were being diverted on the assumption that they would be critically needed for ground artillery support in Europe, and they were eventually so needed. But the cost of that diversion, civilian deaths in London, was immediate and certain, while the benefit was months away and theoretical. The veterans of the air defence of southern England carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Gunners who had seen their shots connect, who had watched flying bombs explode in proximity-fused detonations, who had understood they were saving lives with their work, then experienced the rationing and saw the V-1 kill rates increase. They understood something about warfare that textbooks didn't teach. Sergeant Robert Fairfield, who had served as ammunition handler for a 90mm battery throughout the V-1 campaign, wrote in a memoir published after the war that the rationing of proximity fuses was the moment he understood the true nature of military command. "We weren't told it explicitly," he wrote, "but we all knew what was happening. The ammunition changed. We got fewer of the good rounds. The kills went down. The casualties went up. And we understood that somewhere, someone had made a decision that the flying bombs hitting us were acceptable because of something happening somewhere else, something we didn't see and didn't understand." Fairfield was not bitter about the decision in retrospect. He understood strategy, at least in broad outline, but he recognized something that official military histories often glossed over, that strategic decisions have human consequences that extend far beyond calculations on a map or equations in a planning document. Lieutenant Edmund Cross, the officer who had fired his last proximity-fused rounds at the V-1 that ultimately killed the 47 people in the Elephant and Castle building, spoke publicly only briefly about the experience after the war. In a 1946 radio interview, he said, "We did everything right. We aimed correctly. We calculated correctly. We had the best weapon available. And 47 people still died. That's what warfare is. Sometimes everything you do is correct, and people still die. You have to make peace with that, or the weight of it will crush you." Cross returned to civilian life and became an engineer. He lived to old age, and shortly before his death in 1992, he was interviewed by a historian researching the V-1 campaign. He was asked what he regretted most about his service. He said, "Nothing about the technical aspects. We did our job correctly. What I regret is that we had to ration the fuses. What I regret is that I understand why the decision was made, and I still believe it was wrong." The story of the proximity fuse and its use against the V-1 represents a profound historical irony that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The technology had been developed in secret over years of effort, at enormous cost, with the explicit security restriction that it not be used where it might be captured. Yet the moment it was actually needed, when German flying bombs were destroying London and civilians were dying, the secrecy restriction was lifted immediately. The Pentagon's paranoia about the technology being captured proved to be misplaced. The Germans never did capture a working proximity fuse during the war. When German forces later captured broken fuses from failed V-1 interceptions, they couldn't understand how they worked. German engineers examined the components and concluded that the technology was impossible, that the miniaturization couldn't be achieved, that the reliability couldn't be assured under the G-forces of firing from a cannon. The Germans, working from captured examples and theoretical analysis, concluded that the fuses didn't actually work, that they were some kind of elaborate deception or false technology. They never reverse-engineered proximity fuses successfully. The security restriction, maintained for so long, proved unnecessary. But the delay in deploying the technology to where it was most needed in the defence of civilian populations in England had delayed its use by years. When it was finally deployed, it was devastatingly effective, but the months when it was rationed demonstrated the cost of hesitation. The broader historical significance was that this episode represented one of the first times in modern warfare that civilian populations had been directly protected by advanced technology specifically designed for that purpose. Before proximity fuses, anti-aircraft defense was essentially a desperate gamble fire, thousands of rounds, and hope that luck provided some protective effect. With proximity fuses, anti-aircraft defense became something approaching systematic. The kill rates weren't perfect, but they were effective enough to make a difference in civilian survival rates. This represented a shift in what warfare meant. Strategic bombing had been predicated on the assumption that civilian populations were vulnerable, and that this vulnerability was a feature of air power, not a bug. With proximity fuses, anti-aircraft defenses became effective enough that civilian targets could be meaningfully protected. This had implications that extended far beyond the V-1 campaign. It suggested that technology could be deployed not just to win wars, but to protect innocent populations within those wars. The proximity fuse saw continued use throughout the rest of the war. In the Pacific, VT-fused ammunition continued to protect American ships against Japanese aircraft, and later, suicide attacks. In Europe, artillery equipped with proximity fuses proved effective in direct support of ground operations during the Battle of the Bulge and subsequent campaigns. By war's end, over 22 million proximity fuses had been manufactured. The technology represented one of the most significant military innovations of the Second World War. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, wrote after the war that the proximity fuse had helped blaze the trail to Japan, and that without the protection the technology had given to surface ships, the westward advance across the Pacific would have been far more costly. General George Patton credited the fuses with changing ground warfare. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill noted their effectiveness against the V-1. The technology had proven its value repeatedly. But the workers who built the fuses, the hundreds of thousands of women and men in factories across America, remained largely unknown. Their contribution was classified. The factories where they worked were off-limits to visitors. The nature of what they were building was kept secret even from most of them. Entire shifts of workers in Sylvania plants and Crosley facilities assembled components worth millions of dollars, with every shell and fuse assembled by hand, with the precision required to ensure reliability under extreme conditions, all without knowing what they were making. After the war, some historical attention came to the proximity fuse. It was recognized as one of the three pivotal military technologies of the Second World War, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But it never received the iconic status of those other technologies. The Manhattan Project became legendary, radar became renowned, but the proximity fuse, despite its pervasive impact on the war, remained relatively obscure in public memory. The men and women who fought the V-1 campaign, the anti-aircraft gunners, the radar operators, the fire control personnel were decorated for their service, but never became celebrated heroes. The V-1 campaign wasn't written into popular memory the way other aspects of the war were. It was brutal, it was important, it saved thousands of lives, but it was also somewhat forgotten. The question that remains, the historical question that the veterans themselves grappled with for decades, is whether the decision to ration proximity fuses in October 1944 was correct. Was it the right strategic choice to reduce the availability of the technology in the one theatre where it was proving devastatingly effective in order to preserve it for theoretical future use in another theatre? The answer depends on assumptions about the future that couldn't be known at the time the decision was made. If the Battle of the Bulge had never occurred, if the German counter-offensive in December 1944 hadn't happened, then the decision to divert proximity fuses to ground artillery would have been clearly wrong. The technology would have been sitting in supply depots, unused, while civilians in London died from attacks that could have been prevented. Conversely, if the war had ended without the rationing, if Germany had capitulated in October 1944 instead of May 1945, then the diversion of fuses would have been clearly unnecessary, and the civilian casualties would have been averted deaths that served no strategic purpose. But the war continued. The Battle of the Bulge did occur. The proximity fuses were used in that battle with considerable effect. The strategic choice, made in the fog of war without perfect information, proved defensible, even if the human cost was significant. The final irony of the proximity fuse story is that this revolutionary technology, which represented one of the greatest scientific achievements of the war, ultimately contributed to a transformation in warfare that the scientific community found troubling. After the war, the Americans and British shared the proximity fuse technology with their allies. By the early 1952, proximity fuses were in use in the armies of multiple nations. The technology revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare and field artillery, but the development of more advanced weapons, guided missiles, radar-directed artillery, and ultimately nuclear weapons eventually made the proximity fuse less central to warfare. By the 1962, the technology that had seemed so revolutionary, so significant, so important, was becoming obsolete. The missiles and radar systems that followed were more sophisticated but also more distant from the actual combat. The men who operated them had less direct connection to the targets they were engaging. The veterans of the proximity fuse era, the gunners who had aimed the anti-aircraft batteries, who had understood their role in the system, who had seen the results of their work with direct, visceral clarity, that generation of soldiers was replaced by new generations' operating systems that were more complex, less immediately comprehensible, and more distant from the human experience of war. The women and men who assembled proximity fuses in factories, whose hands built the components that would eventually save thousands of lives, never received formal recognition for their contribution. When the history of the Second World War was written, when the strategic innovations and technological achievements were catalogued and analyzed, the factory workers remained in the background. They were essential to the victory, but they were forgotten. Yet their work survived them. Proximity fuzzes, the technology they built, continued to be used in wars for decades after the Second World War. The technology they had assembled by hand, with meticulous precision, had lasting impact on military affairs that extended far beyond the war that motivated its development. The final lesson of the proximity fuse story is that warfare at its most effective is a combination of scientific innovation, industrial capacity, and human labor performed under extraordinary circumstances. The technology didn't win the war by itself. The men who operated the weapons didn't win the war by themselves. Neither did the workers who built the components. It was the combination, the translation of scientific understanding into manufacturing reality, then deployed by trained personnel in combat situations where their efforts could make a difference. When all those elements came together, when the proximity fuse worked as designed, when trained gunners aimed it correctly, when the strategic decisions supported its deployment, the technology could save lives. When any one element failed or was compromised, when the fuses were rationed, when strategic calculations were made without perfect information, when the human element introduced uncertainty, then even the best technology produced tragic results. The V-1 campaign ended in March 1945, with approximately 75 to 80% of all zones second engaged by anti-aircraft defenses being destroyed. The survivors of that campaign knew that the outcome was not predetermined. They understood that different decisions, made in different offices, by different commanders, could have resulted in very different outcomes. The City of London survived not just because of courage and determination, but because of a technology that few people understood, built by people who didn't know what they were building, and deployed with effectiveness that bordered on the miraculous. This is the story of the proximity fuse. This is the story of how ordinary people, working in factories and manning gun batteries, became part of a larger system of warfare that protected civilian populations from terror weapons. This is the story of the irony of technology in warfare, that the same innovations that can kill with devastating efficiency can also be deployed to save lives, depending on how they are used and by whom. And this is the story of how the decisions made in wartime, the strategic choices made by commanders in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, reverberate through the lives of people who never sat in those commanders' offices, who never saw the maps or read the reports, but who lived with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.